Pro-tithing pastors love to quote 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, which I will read for you now. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. The word give, for let each one give as he purposes in his heart, that's not in the Greek text. But the word giver at the end of this verse, for God loves a cheerful giver, that word giver is dotas, 1325 in Strong's Concordance, and it means to give or to bestow a gift. Now, folks, the verse doesn't say God loves a cheerful tither. If you're paying a tithe, then you are keeping a law. You're keeping the Levitical law, because remember, under the Levitical law, which was instituted at Numbers 18, when God took the tithe, which the pagan people practiced, and he took that into the Levitical law, God adapted it. He adapted it to food, and he also adapted it to 3 tithes, the Levite tithe, the festival tithe, and the poor tithe. And you couldn't opt out of that. If you owned land and you had any agricultural produce, then you had to pay tithes, 3 tithes, on your produce of the land. So God loves a cheerful giver, it says in 2 Corinthians 9:7. He doesn't love a cheerful tither. It's not mentioning tithing. And tithing is an obligation. It's something which you're commanded to do under law. To give, dotas, the bestower of a gift, that's the opposite of tithing. It's the opposite of paying a government taxation or God's tax. If you give, then you cannot be a tither, because to give is the very opposite, the polar opposite of paying a tax. Now look at verse 1, 2 Corinthians 9 verse 1. Now concerning the ministering to the saints, plural, okay? Now concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. For I know your willingness, about which I boast of you, to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. So Paul is referring to the Corinthians giving gifts. And notice who these gifts went to. Did it go to the pastor? Was there a single person in the fellowship called the pastor, and he received all the tithes went to him? No. It went to the saints. And this is something that unfortunately a lot of Christian churches don't obey. You see, you're supposed to help your brother when you see your Christian brother in need. 1 John chapter 3 verse 7 commands us to do that. And what the Corinthian church were doing was they were helping the poor saints in the fellowship. Now, I started studying tithing a year ago when I went to a New Frontiers church here in Plymouth in the United Kingdom. It's called Waterfront City Church, and the pastor Grant, and his surname is a Polish type of surname. It's very long, I couldn't pronounce it. W something or other, about 20 letters. And the church elder, John Peel, they were teaching on tithing, that you must give a tithe. And I went along because I wanted to find out about tithing. I'd heard about it and wanted to find out more. Although I did tithe for 1 month over 20 years ago when I was a oneness Pentecostal very briefly, until God rescued me from that cult. Anyway, these 2 leaders, John Peel and Grant, the pastor of Waterfront City Church, they told students that they had to pay a tithe out of the money that they borrowed from the bank in student loans. So if a student borrows £15,000, I think it's £9,000 to cover your fees. I don't know exactly how it works now, but and you have to pay for your accommodation and your food. So say you borrow £15,000, then the church takes £1,500 of that. And I was shocked at that, because Deuteronomy 14:22 says you're to tithe on your increase. You're not to tithe on borrowed goods. I pointed that out, and I remember, I think it was John, he slapped his leg. Ha, ha, ha! He laughed, and John Peel laughed too. And then they quoted Malachi 3:10, and I said, well, I thought that the context there is the priests. You know, God's writing to the priest. It was the priest who was stealing That's why it says, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse. They had the tithes. The people were paying the tithes. The problem was that the priest was stealing out of the tithe. And again, they just laughed at me. Never got an answer on that. So it was that started me looking into this topic of tithing a year ago. Now, going back after my little detour there, for which I apologize, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1, saints is a plural. Now, concerning the ministering to the saints, you see, they were using food and money because people were giving gifts of money. Okay, tithing had been abolished. They weren't under the tithing law where they had to give exclusively food. And this was going to help poor saints in the fellowship. It wasn't going to one single family in the fellowship who was called the pastor. I would also like to point out that in the New Testament, firstly, there was no office of pastor. Okay, pastor is only used once in the New Testament at Ephesians 4:11, and it just means a shepherd. Now, it's not an office that you fill. You don't become the pastor. It's something that you do. A pastor in that verse, Ephesians 4:11, means somebody who is shepherding the flock, somebody who's caring for the flock. And Ephesians 4:8 is talking about gifts that God has given to the church, not an office. So there's no office of pastor, but godly elders who rule the church well, they will also be shepherds. They'll be shepherds. They won't be hirelings. They're shepherds who are caring for God's flock. Now, in the New Testament, elders was a plural within the body. You didn't have one single pastor in charge of a fellowship. You had a body of elders who ruled the fellowship or who administered the fellowship and cared for the people collectively. Look at Acts 14:23. And when they had ordained them elders in every church, the word ordained is karoteneo, 5,500 in Strong's. It simply means to elect or to appoint. Remember that the King James is translated by Anglican, so you do find a few sort of Anglican-type doctrines in the King James Bible, and therefore in quite a lot of modern Bibles. It's simply meaning they just appointed or they elected elders. It's not talking about, a guy called a bishop with a funny hat that looks like a fish's mouth coming in and having a special ceremony where only after this ceremony was a person then entitled to be a church leader. So because elders is a plural in the New Testament, if tithers or tithing people believe that you must pay your money to the pastor in the church, as there is no office of pastor, what they should do is have a plurality of elders. Maybe in a church of, say, 100 people, you would have 3 or 4 or 5 elders. Well, if you believe that elders should be paid, then you need to pay all of those elders a full-time salary. If you believe that elders deserve to have a free house and free car and free phone, their families have free dental insurance, free medical insurance, then all the elders should get that. Because Acts 14:23, and there are other verses, it talks about a plurality of elders leading churches, not just one. A few verses to consider. I might not have time to read this. 1 Timothy 5:8. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Unfortunately, so many people today, so many churches, break this verse. Your first obligation is to support your family. If your child needs medical attention, then that's the first thing to pay. Providing a roof for your family, food for your children and your wife to eat, paying the utility bills, that is the first responsibility of a Christian. If you don't do that, okay, if you're tithing to a church, then that verse says that actually you're not even a Christian at all, you're actually an unbeliever. We're to also help brothers in need, 1 John 3:17. However, 2 Corinthians 8:14, we give out of our abundance. So we care for our own first. Your first obligation is not to pay the tithe. So pastor idiot can buy a Mercedes or fly around in a jet like Creflo Dollar and Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn once stayed in a hotel in Milan in Italy, and I saw the receipts. It was on a video. $12,000 a night Benny Hinn paid for that suite. These men are wolves and wicked men. So you pay your utility bills, you provide for your family, you care for your family, then you are to give out of your abundance. I'd like to finish with one or two stories because I live in a very poor area of Plymouth. I'm a poor guy myself, and I see an awful lot of wickedness that the churches are doing here. And I've seen a lot of bad things over the years. For instance, before I became a Christian in 1985, in the early 1980s, I had a small flat in Limehouse in East London, and I had a neighbour called Mick, who was from Ireland. And he had an oxygen tank because he said he was ill, so he had a mask he put on his face so he could breathe oxygen. Everything in his flat had been provided for by the church. And the church would send these women down with food for him to eat, and they'd clean his flat for him. Everything in his flat, the carpet, the fridge, the cooker, the television, the video, everything was provided by the church. Well, one day I came home from work and there was a policeman outside Mick's flat. And I was quite shocked, so I asked, and I was told that he had been killed. You see, Mick had these young cousins. I was a bit naive, and I didn't realise that these blonde-haired young boys of about 13 or 14, who were his cousins, were actually young boys that Mick was having sex with. And one of the young boys wanted to break off the relationship. Mick didn't want to do that, so the young boy battered him with a hammer and killed him. And it was in the local paper, Gay Lover Killer. I think the boy was about 14 or 15, I can't remember, it was 30 years ago. Now, Mick was supported by the churches. And you see a lot of this. Here in Plymouth, there are street pastors. What do street pastors do? Street pastors are usually idiot Christians who don't know their Bible. Well, I don't think many of them are even Christians. They're people who attend church. And when they see people late at night who are coming out of the clubs and pubs who are drunk, they give them free sandals, flip-flops, because the women often don't have any shoes. They're not allowed to preach the gospel to them unless they're asked to. This is the state that Christianity has fallen to in the UK. Folks, it's a joke here. Okay? I'm not saying that the churches are like this where you are. Maybe you're listening to me in America or Canada or India or Brazil. I've never been to those countries. I can't comment about the church in those countries. But here in the UK, it is an absolute joke. Churches have food runs where they give food to people. Do they give food to people like me? Not that I've asked for it. No. You know who it goes to? It goes to the feckless. It goes to women with 5 children by 5 different husbands. It goes to people who are ex-criminals, rapists and muggers and thieves who've come out of prison. And the little do-gooding Christians are feeding these people. One final story, the BBC, I think it was the BBC, it was one of the radio shows, I think it was BBC, they reported prostitutes had taken over a street in Birmingham. Well, that evening the Christians were there with flasks of tea and flasks of coffee and little cakes and sandwiches to give to the prostitutes because they wanted to be loving, they wanted to care. And the radio show reported this, I think it was BBC Radio. Well, the Muslims got to hear about it. You know what happened the next day? The Muslims arrived with canes and sticks and walking sticks. And you know what the Muslims did to the pimps? They didn't give them teas and coffees like the Christian, the weak, effeminate, weak, dumbed-down Christians. They caned them! They caned them with the walking sticks! They beat them! And Muslims didn't give a dab about the police. They didn't care about the police. Arrest us, we don't care. Get the hookers off the street. And they were Allahu Akbaring all the way down the street and holding their Muslim prayers. They frightened those pimps away. Folks, this sums up what's wrong with Christianity here in the UK. Christianity is not preaching the gospel here in the UK. The worst of the lot are the evangelicals, by the way. They've been dumbed down by the feminized chorus music. Many evangelical men are sissified wimps. We need real men in the churches who preach the gospel with power.